Acrylic model paints are expensive, more than $5 an ounce in most cases, while in comparison, craft paint is less than $1 an ounce. So if you're able to airbrush the craft paint and still get a model paint finish, why wouldn't you try it? I'm going to show you the tips, tricks, and techniques I've developed to airbrush these cheap craft paints and still achieve a high quality finish. This includes the thinner I use, the airbrush settings, and how to apply these inexpensive paints for the best results. So, let's get started. Okay, before the hate mail starts, model paint has its place, especially for painting fine details with the brush, where craft paint typically fails miserably at this. I mean, when you're trying to get that little spot of rust to look like a little spot of rust and not like a little spot of paint, this is where model paints shine. Alright, with that out of the way, we're not talking about model paint today. We're talking about craft paint and how to achieve a model paint finish on a craft paint budget. Also, it's just fun to see how far you can take this stuff. I mean, I don't mean to say I'm against buying the right supplies for the job, but what I am against is paying 5 times the cost for something that is not 5 times the quality. Also, buying it. Where's the fun in that? Okay, so the two biggest problems with applying any paint through an airbrush or a spray gun are orange peel and runs. And the two biggest complaints about craft paint is that when they're thin enough to go through your airbrush, it doesn't cover and it has a bad tendency to run, or picture frame. Picture frame is when excess paint collects around the hard edges, causing an uneven coverage. Well, I'm here to tell you, all paint will do this if it's not applied with the proper technique, and the technique is almost always dictated by the paint. Also, and I don't care how expensive the paint is, if you're not familiar with its characteristics, don't just mix up a batch and spray it on your model that you've just spent hours painstakingly getting every detail just right. Okay? Okay. So, the paint I've chosen for the demonstration is this Apple Barrel Bright Red. In a previous video, I demonstrated in a head-to-head matchup how model paint is better than craft paint, but it wasn't so much better that in most cases it did not justify the extra expense, and this was the worst performing paint in that test. So in choosing a paint that was not intended for an airbrush, and in fact is not very good through an airbrush, we'll demonstrate that it's the technique that's more important than the paint. Okay, so we have the paint, now we need to thin it. And I'm sure you've all seen the videos where someone's taking windshield washer fluid or a mixture of isopropyl alcohol and water to make up thinner for these craft paints. Now, I have found both of these to be problematic for multiple reasons. First and foremost, they're both toxic, and sometimes they don't react well with the binders and pigments in these paints. Isopropyl alcohol in particular is probably one of the worst things you could use. When I first started airbrushing, I tried all of these, and sometimes they worked great, but when they didn't, it was a total disaster. The paint reacted like cottage cheese, stopping up my airbrush, and it took a couple of days of soaking and poking to get it all cleaned out. After checking out the MSDS sheets for the more popular thinners like Vallejo and Mr. Hobby, a definite pattern emerged. When I looked at the characteristics of the chemicals they were using, which were also hazardous by the way, what they were is just a simple wetting agent. And what's a wetting agent, you ask? Well, it's any substance that reduces the surface tension of water so that it will flow more evenly. At that point, it immediately dawned on me that dishwasher rinse aid was the substance I was looking for, because it is exactly that, a wetting agent used to make water in the rinse cycle of your dishwasher so that it doesn't bead up and leave spots, but instead sheets and runs off. Also, it's much less toxic than the stuff found in the pre-made acrylic thinners and those homebrew recipes you see on the web. If you want to know more, all I can say is look up the MSDS sheets on both window washing fluid and isopropyl alcohol and read what it says about inhalation. In fact, I highly encourage you to check out the MSDS sheets, or SDS sheets as they're called now, for any product you're in regular contact with, and the manufacturers are required by law to provide these. So with a little trial and error, my recipe is a quart of distilled water with about 6 drops of the dishwasher rinse aid and about 6 drops of a vegetable-based glycerin. The glycerin is also a wetting agent, and it helps slow down the drying time just a little bit, and to a certain extent may diminish tip dry, but no, not completely. And I gotta say, I've used this for a while now, and it's worked great with every acrylic paint I've tried it with. So, now, mixing the paint. I do not ever recommend mixing paint directly in the cup, especially craft paint, because these can sometimes be difficult to get to blend with the thinner, and if you're doing it in the cup, you may not notice that big chunk at the bottom. Oh, I should probably take a step back here. Surface preparation is important and should be done the same as if you were going to spray an expensive paint versus a cheap one. Priming is the key to success with craft paint, and the test pieces I'm using today are just chunks of Sintra that have been sanded and primed with Vallejo's acrylic polyurethane surface primer, but spray can primer is just as good, and depending on the project might even be better. So back to the paint. When you're mixing it, start with a little bit of thinner in the bottom of the container. I like these little 1 ounce cups, but anything small and easy to stir and pour out of will work. There's also no hard, fast rule about the amount of paint thinner to paint. It's all about consistency. And you'll need to play around with this a little bit. But what you're looking for is a paint that's just thin enough to go through your airbrush evenly. You'll hear almost everyone say that it needs to be the consistency of milk, but again, every paint is different, and even within the same brand, a good starting point is an approximately 50-50 mix of paint to thinner, and then you'll want to mix that up, adjust it if needed, and then when you think you've got it ready, put just a little bit in the bottom of your airbrush and test it on something. Ideally with a surface similar to what you're getting ready to paint so you can see how it behaves and then adjust again accordingly. So the first tip to an even coat is to make certain that the airbrush is properly atomizing the paint into a fine mist with no spitting or spattering. For most of my base coat applications, I use this old cheap airbrush with a 0.5mm nozzle, and I let the paint dictate the air pressure, which in some cases might be in the neighborhood of 18 to 22 psi. I know that's high, but the higher the pressure, the better the atomization, and the better the coating, and the less likely you are to get that orange peel effect. The dreaded orange peel is what happens when paint droplets are large and don't want to come together and lay flat, so the finer the mist, the better. When you think you have the paint thinned enough and the airbrush dialed in, we want to practice, because every paint is different and the characteristics of each one will dictate how heavy you can go before it causes it to run. With acrylics, I always err on the side of many thin coats more than I do 2 or 3 heavy wet coats. Also, you want to allow it to flash of its own accord before helping it along with anything like a hairdryer or a hot box. The paint itself will dictate how many layers you need to go with. You might get away with 2, you might need as many as 4 or 5 to make sure you've got the coverage you're looking for, and the thinner the layers, the less detail you're going to lose along the way. And this brings us to my number 1 tip for modeling is slow down. If you try to rush and push the paint beyond its physical capabilities, you're going to get in trouble and end up with a crap job that you'll just have to sand out and start over. Remember, for the majority of us, this is a hobby, so what's the rush? If the end goal you're looking for is fidelity to the thing you're making, then taking the time to get it right is more important than getting it done. For me anyway, beyond getting the model to look the way I want, I genuinely enjoy the process of solving problems to the point I intentionally create puzzles like this to solve. The process of trial and discovery is just fun for me. So at the end of the day, the paint you use is your choice. And hopefully the techniques I've showed you here will open up a wider variety of paints you can use for your models or whatever project you're working on, and maybe even help reallocate some of your modeling budget to acquiring more models. As a practicing tightwad, I get a lot of enjoyment out of finding the best deals on the kits and supplies I'm looking for, and don't mind scouring the internet looking for them. I've even developed a bit of a system for doing this, and I'm thinking about putting that into a video, so keep an eye out for that. As an example of what you can save, I'm building 3 different models that will all have the same military green base coat, and I didn't have enough of the exact color, so I needed to mix it myself to make sure everything matched, and I was able to make up enough to cover all 3 models for less than $2, when the same amount of model paint would have cost anywhere from $12 to $15. Same for the paint thinner recipe I came up with. I didn't have any airbrush thinner at the time, so that's when I looked up the ingredients on the MSDS sheet to see if I could find a substitute, and I actually think I came up with something that's even better than the pre-made stuff. So if you want to learn more about the characteristics of some of these craft paints, check out my video here, and with that, thank you for joining me, and go make something.